This we have the Director General of, beg your pardon, we have in the studio Suleiman Mande, who is in the studio from the Civil Society Legislative Advocacy Center to talk about this. We hope to have other guests join us subsequently as we proceed with this discussion on the program. So, but for now, let's start up the discussion. Thank you so much for joining us on Daybreak this morning, Suleiman.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate being invited.
All right. Well, the news is a cheering one for many workers who have been following right from the speech of the president yesterday. It appears the president is quite determined to ensure that there is no shutdown of the system. But my concern is it appears as though we have to wait for labor to threaten to issue this kind of threats that they did for an indefinite nationwide strike to commence today before we come to the discussion table and really put something on the table that will assuage the labor unions. The unions have been complaining about government not taking this seriously, and until yesterday, when the president made a promise that there will be an increase of 35,000 naira for workers, in the federal civil service, and that seemed to have worked the magic. And then the subsequent discussions that we saw even late into the night yesterday. So why do we have to wait?
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to sympathize with the Nigerian people for the suffering I would say we are going through, because everybody is feeling the heat. Second of all, I think we have to look at it from two perspectives, from the perspective of the government and from the perspective of the people. Is it really the will of the government to solve this problem, looking at the current problems, the current suffering Nigerians are in? Or is it truly because of the pressure being put by the labor union, right? For me, it's because of the pressure. It's not because the government truly wants to solve this problem or truly wants to help the people. Going to your question, I think this is what we expect to happen when, you don't have a pre-planned activities. In other words, when you don't plan what you want to do when you assume office, this is exactly what will happen. I had an engagement on a radio station some time ago, and this is exactly the kinds of question that they asked me. And my answer is, had President Bola Tinubu put up a sound management team before assuming office, that planned, what he envisioned to achieve for Nigeria and Nigerians, these kinds of problems would never pop up, right? But because there are no plans put in place before coming into office, you just assume that when you come to office, every problem that comes, you'll be able to solve. It doesn't happen that way. In civil society, in an NGO for that matter, the activities that we do, there is what we call design stage, implementation. That's when you plan what you want to do, the activities you want to do before even going to the field, right? That helps you manage all the risks that may come up during the implementation of the project or the program. So I think it boils down to the fact that the president and his team did not well plan ahead what they truly needed to do for Nigeria and Nigerians. This is why we have these kinds of problems at the moment.
Some Nigerians, are of the opinion that the Labour Union Congress and the TUC actually took longer, just like Ayuba mentioned earlier. They took longer to give the government an ultimatum. I mean, we saw at the first early month, they started as though they were going on strike, and then they took a step back, and it was like the government was having the upper hand. So right now, we saw them make a decision, and at least it's a first step, but still, there's a pause that means this discussion could take another, or negotiation would take another lengthy period of time. Do you think the NLC and the TUC are doing enough as it is right now?
Well, what I have to say is that, you know, this is a positive step, right? This is a very good step in the right direction. We can't say that they are not doing enough, but this, at this very moment, at this very critical moment, they have done the right thing. They take the right step, right? But like always, we have to always look at things from the perspective of what the citizens will end up gaining, right? So the labor union really did well. This is a very good thing. But we also have to look at the sustainability. What is the sustainability plan of the policy, right? We hear that it's just 6 months. Then the question now remains, what happens after? But my point is, we have to really commend the labor union and the TUC for putting up the act, for taking this decision, for taking this action, because at least the government now make the right move to do something for Nigerians. Remember, this has been happening for quite a long time, and the government seemed to just give it, like, you know.
But when we talk about, you know, making something to happen for Nigerians, I'm a bit skeptical, because this new promise, or I would say the increase of the salaries for the next 6 months anyways, it's only for federal government workers. What about those at the state government level and those in the private sector? Because that's also a conversation that we need to have. Majority of Nigerians are in the private sector, and if you are to combine both workers at the federal and state level, may not be even up to 2% of the entire workforce in the country. So, I mean, maybe even less than 1%. So what exactly are we talking about? Can this really go that far in ameliorating the difficulties that Nigerians are dealing with?
Well, I think one of the agreements, I think, is for the government to put pressure on the state governments as well, and the local governments, right, to make sure that they implement this policy as well, right? And also even the private sector. I think this has been one of the agreements. And I believe that most of the private sectors abide by the labor law, right? They protect the interest of their workers according to the laws of the federation. So it's really something that every aspect of government and even the private sector should look into. But of course, like you mentioned, right, the average Nigerians who don't work, what is going to be their benefit?
Do you really see labor representing the interest of workers who are not in the government service?
Well, I think I'll look at it this way. They abide by their mandate, right, to protect the interest of the workers in the country. So it's good when they consider other people who are out of the payroll of the government or even the private sector or the labor law. It's a very good thing, but we cannot accuse them of anything where they don't, because they always abide by their mandate, protecting the interest of Nigerian workers. But of course, we have to extend the discussion to the general public who don't work, because they form the major part, the large part of the population of the country. And the government should extend the palliative as well to them. They are the ones who have the biggest share of the votes, right? So it's a good thing when the government truly consider them as well. It's a good thing. This should be something that the government must put into consideration.
Mr. Mande, let's take a look at this thing, you know, from the start, from the removal of subsidy, and there was a leakage of saying the federal government is actually paying some subsidy. And right now, the money the federal government is spending, I mean, when we start amounting it, it could actually lead to the amount they were paying for the subsidy before. Do you think all of these things are something that could have been averted, you know, maybe from the beginning when the president made that speech on his inauguration speech?
That's why I said in the beginning of my conversation that, you know, the president did not come with a sound plan. He assumed office without any good plan for the country. So this is, like I mentioned, what you expect to happen when you don't have good plans before you assume a position of responsibility. Right? This is exactly what will happen. And that is why we are in the situation we are in at the moment.
Mm. Okay, so as part of this agreement, the meeting between the federal government and the unions resolved that a minimum wage committee will be inaugurated. It shall be inaugurated within 1 month. It's part of the agreement. And this suspension of the strike is to last for 30 days, you know, just 1 month. And after which, I believe the unions will go back and review all the promises made and whether or not there have been implementation and all. But, you know, when you think about it, at the very first meeting between the federal government, the TUC, and the NLC, there was this conversation about a committee to review the minimum wage. And till now, we are still talking about that committee being inaugurated, meaning that after the, I mean, about 4 months now, or 5 months, that committee, you know, has not been taken seriously, which seemed to validate what the NLC and the TUC is accusing the federal government of. Are you optimistic that this time we'll actually see, you know, an implementation of whatever that has been agreed upon?
Well, they say never. I am always optimistic about Nigeria's positive growth and development, and I'm always optimistic about, you know, the government doing the right thing. Okay, but talking about the committee, I think a serious commitment has to be made from the government. You should do what you say you will do at all times, right? This is the only way that, you know, the Nigerian citizen will take you as responsible as, you know, a serious government that truly represents them, right? The committee should be able to carry out its mandates, right, as stipulated, as agreed upon. But I think there is a serious problem when it comes to these kinds of things. Mm. The reason why the government is even taking a serious action right now is because, you know, the labor union is really serious about going for the strike. And yes, it really understands the implication, especially the economic implication, yes, on its on his pockets. Okay,
so I'm going to ask you to hold your thoughts there while we join our other guest who is joining us virtually. He is Comrade Isa Aremu himself, who was once union leader at the NLC. He is now the Director General of the Michael Imodu National Institute for Labor Studies, Ilorin Center in Kwara State. Thank you so much for joining us on Daybreak this morning, Mr. Isa Aremu.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be with you this morning, Trust TV, for your viewers globally.
Comrade, it appears that the hands of the government had to be forced to reach an agreement that is accepted by both unions, the TUC and the NLC. Do we always have to get to this point? I mean, I threw the same question to our guest here in the studio, Suleiman Mande, but it appears that the only language that the government truly understands is a national shutdown.
Well, I'm not sure it would be appropriate to put it that way, but first, let me just say it's victory for both the government as well as for the organized labor that through the instrumentality of social dialogue, engagement for the past 48 hours, We now have 15-point agreement, between the two parties. One, the most significant is that the strike and the protests have been suspended. And I've always been saying so that the strike was not inevitable, was preventable, for as long as the two parties adopt the spirit of dialogue. Then you also have the wage component of this agreement. You have the non-wage component. The wage component, and I think I listened to you very well, including the co-discussant. I think now we have additional 35,000 naira that will be given to all federal employees, which means effectively now you can say that the unofficial new federal minimum wage comes to about 65,000, because the current minimum wage earners, collect 30,000, at least legally backed up. If you had 35, that's about 65,000. Even though this one is not yet backed up by law, but at least for the period between now and the time the new minimum wage will be in place, that's also significant. You also have the tax component, which means for the next 6 months, I think VAT has been suspended, for diesel. Of course, the two parties also agreed to take the issue of refining seriously. I think there's a joint committee now that we visit the refineries that are under repairs. Don't forget that the issue of fixing a refinery has been at the center of the protests and the agitation by labor, that we can't afford to be importing products that we should be refining locally. We can be on our own, but the 15-point agreement, very, very significant. So I want to say that it's victory for our industrial relation machinery, that we can have dialogue, we can have discussion, and we can have results, as we have been announced. But I also listened to you very well that this could have been done much more earlier. And I think the lesson for the government is that reforms are inevitable, but in carrying out reforms, you need to also factor the impact of your reforms on the citizens. In this case, the working men and women. And I thought that from day one, if you can, by the time the government
part of the concern for many subsidy, people, for many Nigerians,
we don't properly engage.
And what is
possibly we should have
if you can hear me,
address these issues.
Part of the challenges that we've had in the past, and which is bringing about this lack of trust on government's promises, is the lack of commitment and implementation of promises. So, for instance, this issue about the committee, the National Minimum Wage Committee, one of the first agreements that was had between the federal government and the unions was that a committee will be set up to review the national minimum wage. It is now that we're hearing that that committee should be inaugurated within the next 1 month. So what has been happening all along? And then secondly, you mentioned also and noted that this new increase is not backed by law yet. So should we really be that excited, or are we confident that government will implement and do exactly as it says it will do? What do we have to hold government to?
Yeah, I think first on the issue of the new minimum wage, don't forget that the minimum wage cycle is a 5-year cycle. And the current minimum wage will not elapse until next year. So even when Labour was putting this issue on the agenda before, it was to make sure that as much as possible, the federal government is proactive enough to engage, to put the presidential committee in place. Don't also forget that this law minimum wage goes beyond organized labor and federal government. It involves state government, it involves employers in the private sector, represented by Nigeria Employer Consultative Association. So for you to have comprehensive review of national minimum wage, I think the earlier the better that we start on time. But as you said, this ought to have been done much more earlier because Labour has been asking for better than never. But I also want to put on record that the new minimum wage can only be coming to force next year. So we still have some time. But now that we have time limit to it, I think it's in the best interest of all the parties to make sure that we don't resume back to another round of agitation for strike before we implement that, to get this implemented. Then another very critical point, which I would like to raise, is that, more than ever before, government should take labor serious. Labor is very, very critical in wealth generation. In fact, it's the most important factor of production. And there's no way President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, who has announced the 8-point agenda dealing with education, health, security, anti-corruption, none of this agenda can be pursued if you don't have highly well-motivated, productive workforce. And the basis of it is that you have to pay them very well. Even at 65,000, I'm telling you, which is the unofficial minimum wage. Now, how much is it? It's just about, depending on what rate you are using, it's just about $60 or $65, per month. When actually in 2016, we're having a minimum wage of about 18,000, which amounted to about $101 per month. But now with the rate of devaluation, inflation, we are already having wage collapse in our hand. So what I want to say here is that labor should not be underrated. It has to be factored into development. And don't also forget this agreement is also based on, there's a clause that says that labor only suspended the action. And if the agreement is not respected, labor has the capacity to also resume back the need for protest or strike. But on the whole, I want to say the agreement so far is victory for workplace democracy, industrial democracy. What I mean by that is that dialogue, negotiation, discussion are the better way to get sustainable results in the world of work.
Let's talk about, the agreements. We saw a lot of, numerous agreements being made about not only the 35,000, we have 25,000 being intended to share to 15 million households every month. We also saw the fact that there will be VAT reduction or removal for some people. We saw them saying that some farmers would be aided, with what they need for farm produce, to make their farm produce easy. And also, I think they covered the aspects of, should I say, the traders, trying to cover virtually everything. But do you think that with all the agreements, if it was to be implemented, the right way with transparency and accountability, do you think it would cover every Nigerian? Because everybody in Nigeria is already facing this particular bond, of this hardship of the subsidy removal. So do you think everything, every aspect, every person in Nigeria was covered with this agreement made by the NLC, TUC, and the federal government?
Well, we can all analyze that. As they say, the devil is in the details, but the 15-point agreement, I think, is comprehensive enough. You have the wage component, you have the non-wage component. If you suspend value-added tax on diesel, that doesn't only affect the workers, it affects all the citizens, who still rely on generators in the absence of power supply. If you also talk of CNG buses, that means the gas-driven buses that government is committed to provide, if that becomes a reality, that impacts on all the citizens. You also, they also have direct transport, 25,000 naira, to informal sector, small and medium enterprises. I think that also that also impacts on the citizens as a whole. So what I'm saying here is that if you look at this 15-point agreement, I think Labour has tried as much as possible to go beyond their own interests alone. Because ideally, Nigeria Labour Congress, TUC, they are made up of members of the unions. It's only those who pay union dues. But, labor has become even more selfless to consider other sectors of the economy and carry them along. But the one that I'm quite excited about is the item 15, of this 15-point memorandum, which also agrees that they will find the memorandum. The memorandum will be filed in relevant court of competence, for jurisdiction within a week, which means it becomes like a consent judgment. So that it's legally binding on both the federal government and the organized labor to agree on this, the implementation of what has been agreed upon. And this is quite a very good radical departure, which means more than ever before, it's not just for you to have an agreement, but make sure you implement the agreement. Okay. And I think federal government in particular must have learned from this experience that it's time for us to take, labor much more serious, and that all citizens, I say, well, not just labor, right, that you are carrying out reforms, look at the impact of your reforms on the well-being of the citizens. Okay. And I hope subsequent reforms will be able to be more proactive so that we are not just reacting. As we are carrying out programs or reforms, there should be what they call just
all right, comrade, I would ask that you pause.
At the impact of the citizens and see how to ameliorate the impact.
Our guest here in the studio, Suleiman. One of the issues that many people have raised reservations about is the social register that will be used for the distribution of this government intervention. Now we have about the expansion of the social register to cover 15 more million households, and the government intends to share this 75,000 naira across 3 months. So you have stipends paid in 25,000 naira for households and all that. How optimistic are you that this, or I would say, have we addressed the issues that there were with the social register that led to these complaints about the targeted Nigerians are not really being reached with these interventions?
Well, let me say that the issue of the social register is a very, very serious issue, and the government must take a serious step in order to address that. The reason why I say that is because I know quite a lot about how that process goes because of my experience in the rural areas in my local government, for example. This whole process has been hijacked by quote-unquote politicians, right? And their boys and all that. So my concern is I truly want to see Nigerians who are really, really suffering, who truly want support, to be included in that, right? To be included, to benefit from all the government's palliative and support. The problem we have, like I mentioned, is politicians will try to hijack the system, the process, so that it is only their followers, their loyalists that will benefit, not necessarily the Nigerians who are truly, really feeling the pain.
So how do we address that? Should we just squash the whole idea of sharing these stipends, or are there better ways that we can come up with to ensure that we actually reach the target?
The better way is to abide by the principles of accountability and transparency in governance, in the distribution. The politicians should really, really put in their minds that these are the people that brought me here. These are the people that vote me. Whether they vote me or not, I represent them, so they should benefit, right? So they should really, really put in mind that, Nigerians are really, really suffering, and this is something that they must put into serious consideration.
Under one of the clause here, it says a joint visitation will be made, from the NLC and the federal government to the refineries to ascertain the rehabilitation status. Now, nobody is really talking about the refineries, knowing that it is one of the major components that if it is fixed, we know it would, reduce the fuel price. And if the pump price is reduced, a lot of things would be affected. It will actually lower the price of commodity and other things. So what is your take on that particular clause?
My take is that, this is a very, very good step in the right direction as well. But the government should do all it can to make sure that our refineries are revived, right? Because like the comrade said, labor is the most critical aspect in production, right? And one of our problems in Nigeria, in Africa in fact, is that we so much depend on other people to produce goods and services for us. When there is no adequate production in a country, then the result is that, the country have to be importing goods and services at a very, very high cost, and the economy will go down. The value of the currency will go down. That's why we are seeing the Naira devaluation at the moment, okay? So we should the government should really consider how to boost production so that we will have an ease in the way and manner in which we survive.
Okay, thank you, Suleiman Mande. Well, let's go to Comrade Issa Aremu finally for your final thoughts, and also I'd like for you to speak to the issue of the referral of the issue of federal workers in the federal-owned educational institutions being owed the outstanding salaries. Now, talking about the tertiary education workers, ASU inclusive, and the rest of them. Are you satisfied with the way the Ministry of Labor has treated that matter so far? And are you confident that they will actually deal with this issue within the time frame that the Labor is giving? Okay, it appears that we've lost Issa Aremu, unfortunately, but that's where we end this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us, Suleiman Mande, who is from the Civil Society Legislative Advocacy Center. He's a public affairs analyst. Thank you so much. We appreciate you joining us.
I appreciate being here. Thank you.
All right, we'll take a short break now, and then when we return,